The napkin in my lap was the fanciest thing I'd touched all year, and I kept smoothing it flat over my thighs like it might somehow stretch far enough to hide the rest of me. Heavy linen, the kind that doesn't wrinkle no matter how nervous your hands get. I'd already folded and refolded it 11 times. 12, now. The restaurant sat on the top floor of one of those glass towers in Yorkville. The part of Toronto where the coat check girl earns more in tips than I clear in a slow week. Outside the window, the whole city glittered under a February sky, the lake somewhere out in the dark, streetcars crawling far below like lit-up beetles. Inside, everything was hush and candlelight, and the small, polite clink of silver on china. The sound of people who have never once opened a bank envelope with their stomach dropping. I checked the little brass clock on the wall. 22 minutes late. He wasn't coming. Men like the one my friend had described. Serious, old-fashioned, generous. The words she'd used on the phone like she was selling me a used Corolla. Men like that do not show up for a woman like me. Let me be honest about the woman like me, because the story doesn't work if I lie about her. I was 28. I ran my grandmother's bakery on College Street, down in Little Italy, the one with the cracked tile floor and the oven that groaned like an old dog when you lit it. I smelled like vanilla and yeast most days, and I'd made peace with that. What I hadn't made peace with was the dress. My friend Colleen had zipped me into it that afternoon in her bathroom. A deep wine-red thing that clung everywhere I usually kept covered, and told me I looked like a movie star. I looked like a baker who'd been poured into a costume. Soft stomach, wide hips, arms that had lifted 40-pound flour sacks since I was 15. In the mirror I'd wanted to cry, and instead I'd laughed, because crying takes off your mascara and laughing doesn't. The only reason I was there at all was the pink slip of paper still sitting on my kitchen counter at home. Final notice. The bank wanted the arrears on the mortgage my grandmother had signed 30 years ago, and the landlord had jacked the lease renewal, and my flour supplier had stopped answering my calls, and the property tax bill for the building had come in like a slap. $120,000, give or take, standing between me and losing the only thing my Nana ever left me that mattered. So when Colleen said a business associate of her husband's was looking for a companion and was known to be very, very generous, I'd said yes before my pride could stop my mouth. "Is the gentleman joining you shortly, miss?" The waiter had appeared beside me the way they do, silent, his face arranged into something just this side of pity. "Any minute now," I said. My voice came out thin. "Traffic, probably. The gardener's a nightmare tonight." He gave me a nod so small it was basically a shrug and glided off, but not before his eyes did a quick lap of my dress. I felt my whole face go hot. I reached for my water, and that's when I saw him. Not my date, my ex, Cody. Standing near the host, stand in a suit that had been nice maybe 4 years and 2 owners ago, shiny at the elbows, arguing with the maitre d'. His hair was greasy, and he'd lost weight, the bad kind, the kind that comes from vodka instead of food. Even from across the room I could imagine the smell of him. Cheap beer and menthols and that cologne he thought made him classy. My stomach turned right over. Cody was supposed to be in Niagara Falls, chasing whatever get-rich thing had replaced the last get-rich thing. He'd called me 2 weeks earlier to beg for money I didn't have, and I'd hung up on him. And now here he was. A bad penny in a room full of gold. I slid down in the booth and prayed the dim light would swallow me whole. It didn't. He clocked me the way a hawk clocks a rabbit, and something ugly and delighted crossed his face, and he shook the maitre d' off and came weaving between the white-clothed tables straight at me. "Well," he said, dropping into the empty chair across from mine, my date's chair like he owned it. "Look at you, all dolled up." He picked up the untouched wine glass, sniffed it. "This is a nice place, Nessie." He'd always called me Nessie, and I'd always hated it. "Who's the sucker paying?" "Get out," I said, low. "Cody, I mean it. Or what?" He leaned back, spread his knees, made himself at home. "You'll bake me to death?" He laughed at his own joke. "Come on, you owe me. All those years I put up with you, dragging you to parties, and this is how. I don't owe you anything. You owe me 40 grand is what you owe me." His voice cracked up an octave, and a couple at the next table glanced over. "The Albanians, Ness." "Sorry, that's what you kids." He waved a hand. "The guys I owe, they don't play. I saw the paper, I saw your little shop's in trouble, and I figured, hey, my girl always did land on her feet. So how about, I'm not your girl. I haven't been your girl in 3 years. He grabbed my wrist across the table. Not hard enough to bruise, hard enough to make the point. Don't, he said, all the fake charm gone, embarrass me. And then a shadow fell over the both of us, and a voice said, quiet and even, that's my seat. I looked up and up. The man standing over us was tall in a way that reorganized the room around him. Broad through the shoulders into charcoal suit that fit like it had been stitched to his skin. Dark hair going a little silver at the temples, a jaw you could have cut bread on, and eyes so dark they looked black in the candlelight. There was a stillness to him that was worse than any yelling could have been. The kind of quiet a room gets right before the weather turns. Cody blinked up at him. Excuse me? You're sitting in my seat, the man said, holding my fiancé's wrist. You'll want to let go of both. I hadn't told anyone I had a fiancé. I didn't have a fiancé. But the man's eyes flicked to me for half a second, and something in them said, play along, and I'll get you out of this, and God help me. I let go of the truth and grabbed the rope. Cody laughed, but it wobbled. Fiancé. Her? Buddy. I don't know what she told you, but... The man didn't raise his voice. He just leaned down, put one hand on the back of Cody's chair, and said something too soft for me to catch. Whatever it was drained every drop of color out of my ex's face. Cody stood up so fast, the chair scraped. He looked at me, and there was real fear in his eyes now, and something like hatred, and he backed away between the tables and was gone. The man straightened his cuffs, sat down across from me, in his seat, signaled the waiter with 2 fingers. You looked, he said, like you needed a rescue. I dislike watching men grab women. I had it handled, I said, which was a lie, and we both knew it, and the corner of his mouth moved a fraction of a millimeter. I'm sure you did. His name, he told me, was Lorenzo Ferraro. He said it the way you'd tell someone the name of a bridge they already knew not to cross. I didn't recognize it, not really. But I recognized the way the waiter's hands trembled, bringing the wine. The way the maitre d' kept glancing over like he was making sure we had everything, absolutely everything we could possibly want. This was a man the whole room was afraid of, and I had somehow agreed to marry him 90 seconds ago. You're not the man my friend sent me here to meet, I said. No. He poured the wine himself, waving the waiter off. The man your friend sent you to meet works for me. When he described the arrangement to me, a baker, in debt discreet, I decided I'd come myself. He slid the glass toward me. Drink, then we'll talk business. What business? He set his elbows on the table and leaned in, and where Cody had done the same thing and made my skin crawl, this felt more like being let in on a secret. I need a wife, he said. For 1 year. On paper, to start. I choked on the wine. He waited, unbothered, while I coughed into my napkin. A wife, he said again when I'd recovered. A fiancé now, a wife by summer. There are people watching me who believe a man alone is a man without weaknesses, and a man without weaknesses is a man they can't predict, and men they can't predict make them nervous. I'm tired of nervous men. A wife makes me legible, domestic, softens the picture. He turned the stem of his glass a quarter turn. In exchange, your grandmother's bakery gets clear. The mortgage, the arrears, the supplier, the lease, all of it, gone by Friday. And 100,000 more, in trust, so you never have to sit across from a man like your ex again with fear on your face. I stared at him. My mouth had gone dry. You don't even know me. I know you own Sweet Haven on College Street, he said, and started ticking points off on his fingers like a grocery list. I know your grandmother left it to you, and that her name was Rosaria, and that the recipe you're proudest of is the one for the almond riccarelli, because it was the first thing she taught you. I know you're 4 months behind on the mortgage, 2 months behind with your flour supplier, and that the city inspector who's coming next week to look at your ventilation is going to fail you, because you can't afford the ductwork. I know it would take you $120,000 to breathe again. His dark eyes held mine. And I know your ex owes some very unpleasant people $40,000, and that he thinks the answer to that problem is you. The horror must have shown on my face, because his voice gentled, just slightly. I'm not the danger to you in this room tonight, he said. That man was. I should have run. Every sensible bone in my body, and I have a lot of bones, and most of them are sensible, was screaming at me to get up, take the streetcar home, and forget this whole surreal night ever happened. Instead, I heard myself ask, in a small voice, why me? You could buy any woman in this city. The thin, the polished ones, the ones who pick at salads and never worry about an overdraft. Why the baker? He looked at me for a long moment. Really looked, the way no man had looked at me in years. Not with disgust and not with charity, just with a kind of frank attention that made me want to cover myself and made me want to sit up straighter at the same time. Because, he said, when your ex grabbed you, you didn't shrink. You told him to get out. A woman with a spine is harder to frighten, and I've had enough of frightened people to last 3 lifetimes. He picked up his own glass. Also, you eat. I watched you eye that breadbasket like an old friend. I've spent my whole life across tables from people who don't eat, who push food around a plate, and my grandmother used to say you can't trust a person who won't eat. It means they're hiding something, and you're not hiding anything? I'm hiding everything, he said, but not from my appetite. I laughed. I didn't mean to. It surprised us both. I said yes over the recciarelli, which they didn't have on the menu, but which the kitchen produced 20 minutes after. Lorenzo murmured something to the maitre d', and they weren't as good as my grandmother's, but I ate every one. By Friday, it was all gone. I sat at my grandmother's old desk in the back of the bakery and watched the numbers in my accounts do something they hadn't done in 3 years, which was climb. The mortgage. Paid. The supplier. Paid. Plus a note apologizing for the delay that made me snort coffee out my nose. The lease renewed at the old rate, the landlord suddenly very reasonable. The ventilation ductwork was replaced over a single weekend by a crew who called me ma'am and refused a tip. It felt like waking up from a nightmare into a dream and not being sure which one was more likely to hurt when it ended. There was a ring, too. He put it on my finger himself in the back of a car that smelled of leather and cold air, a stone so big it looked fake, and I knew, sickly, that it wasn't. You'll wear it, he said. You'll come to the events. You'll let people see you laugh at my jokes. A pause. I don't have many jokes. I'll bring my own material, I said, and he almost smiled. Colleen lost her mind, of course. She showed up at the bakery the next morning, grabbed my hand, screamed loud enough to scare the pigeons off College Street, and then went very quiet when I told her who, exactly, I'd gotten engaged to. Ness, she said. Do you know what he is? I told her I was starting to. She held my hand tighter and said, You call me. Any hour. You call me, and I loved her more in that moment than I have ever loved anyone who wasn't blood. I want to tell you it stayed a business arrangement. It didn't. And if I'm being the honest kind of storyteller and not the flattering kind, it started to fall apart the night he came to the bakery. I'd been staying late, testing a new sourdough, flour to my elbows, radio playing the oldies station out of Hamilton, when I heard the back door. I thought it was Lorenzo. He'd taken to dropping by, sitting on a stool in the corner in a $3,000 suit, watching me work without saying much, and I'd stopped minding. It wasn't Lorenzo, it was Cody, and he had a knife. You, he said. His eyes were pinpricks. Whatever he was on, it wasn't beer. You landed on your feet. Course you did, fat little Nessie and her diamond. He waved the knife, sloppy, drunk on more than one thing. The Albanians want their money and you're gonna give it to me. Give me the ring. No, I said. Give me the ring. He came around the counter. I'll pawn it. Clears my debt, gets me out of town. Your sugar daddy won't even notice. He'll buy you 10 more. I said no. You don't get to say no to me. He was close now, close enough that I could smell him, close enough that the knife caught the light. You were nothing without me. You're nothing now. Just a fat, pathetic. I didn't decide to do it. My hand found the fresh 5-pound bag of high-gluten flour I'd left open on the counter, and as he lunged, I swung it into the side of his head with everything 2 decades of kneading dough had put into my arms. The bag split. Flour went up like a bomb going off in a mill. Cody went down sideways into the display case, glass and eclairs everywhere, coughing white, and I stood over him in a cloud of my grandmother's flour, with the empty bag in my fist, shaking absolutely coated head to toe, and I did not feel pathetic. I felt like a Viking. That's how Lorenzo found us, coming through the door with 2 of his men behind him. He'd gotten an alert, he explained later. He had cameras on the bakery I hadn't known about, and I decided not to be angry about that particular thing until a calmer week. He took one look at the scene, his fiancée white as a ghost with rage, her ex flat on the floor, moaning in a snowdrift of Robin Hood. And the corner of his mouth did that thing, that quarter-millimeter thing, and then his face went cold as the lake in January, and he told his men to take Cody outside. "Don't kill him," I said. I don't know why. He'd just come at me with a knife, but I heard myself say it. "Please, don't." Lorenzo looked at me for a long moment, flour on my eyelashes, glass at my feet. "You have a soft heart," he said, "for a woman with such a good swing." "He's not worth what it'd cost you," I said. And that, I think, was the first moment he looked at me like I might be a person and not a picture. He had his men put the fear of God into Cody and turn him loose, and he stayed behind, and he took a broom off the wall. A Mafia boss, sweeping up my broken eclairs. And while we cleaned, he asked me, quietly, whether I was hurt, and I said no, and he said good. And neither of us mentioned that his hands weren't quite steady either. He didn't want to let me go home alone. So I did the thing that surprised us both again. I made him dinner. Right there, in the bakery, I turned the flour disaster into a plate of cacio e pepe from the pasta I kept in the back and the good pecorino. And I set it in front of the most dangerous man in the city, on a chipped plate at the little table where I did my books. And he ate it slowly, methodically, and then he ate a second helping, and when he thought I wasn't looking, he closed his eyes. "You're staring," he said, not opening them. "You're the one with your eyes closed." "I have never," he said, "seen a woman eat the way you eat, or cook the way you cook. The women I used to dine with treated food like an accusation. Life's too short for dry salad," I said, wiping sauce off my chin with the back of my hand, "which is not how you're supposed to eat in front of a man you're marrying. And I did it on purpose. You're not what I thought you'd be, you know. What did you think I'd be?" "A monster," I shrugged. "You're just lonely. You've got all this money and no idea what to do with it that doesn't involve scaring people." He went very still, the fork halfway to his mouth. Nobody, I would learn, talked to him like that. Nobody dared to read him aloud. And instead of the cold coming down over his face, something else moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like relief, and he set the fork down and he said, "My grandmother made cacio e pepe. In Calabria. Before all of this." He gestured vaguely at the whole world. "You've made me homesick for a country I left when I was 6. I reached across the little table, past the numbers and the receipts, and I put my flour-dusted hand over his, and he let me. That was the night the paper started becoming real. It's a strange thing to fall in love on a schedule. We had a wedding to plan, a fake one that got realer every time we chose a real flower or a real song. He learned that I hum when I bake and can't carry a tune to save my life. I learned that under the suits he had a temper. He kept on a chain and a loyalty that terrified me with its depth, that the men who worked for him would have walked into traffic for him, and that he never once raised his voice to me, even when I deserved it. And there was the night. I'll tell this part carefully, because this is a story for the tender-hearted, and I mean it to be tender. The night I stopped hiding from him. I'd spent my whole life keeping the lights off, keeping my body a rumor, and he wouldn't let me. He said no when I reached to cover myself, and it wasn't a command like the ones he gave his men. It was quieter than that. He said, "Look at me," and I did, and he told me I was magnificent, and he kissed the parts of me I'd been taught to apologize for, and he lingered there instead of hurrying past, and I cried, and it wasn't sad crying. It was the crying you do when someone finally tells the truth about you, and it turns out the truth is kind. "Mine," he said against my hair. "No one hurts you again. I'll burn this whole city down first." And I believed him, because he was a man who could actually do it, and that should have frightened me, and instead it undid me completely. We married in June. It rained, which is supposed to be good luck, and my grandmother's rosary was sewn into the hem of my dress. And Colleen cried so hard she had to redo her makeup twice, and I meant every word I said at that altar, even though I'd walked into it as a business deal. His men lined the church like a wall of dark suits, and every one of them nodded to me as I passed. And I understood that I hadn't just married a man. I'd married a whole world. But the thing about that world is that it has its own weather, and a storm had been building the whole time I'd been busy falling in love. There was another crew. East End, older money, a man named Dragan Kovac who ran the docks in the concrete, and had for years kept an uneasy peace with my husband. Lines drawn, territories agreed, a handshake that held right up until it didn't. Lorenzo had gotten stronger. The construction contracts for the new waterfront, the unions, the ports where the lake meets the seaway. He'd been squeezing Dragan out, contract by contract, and Dragan had watched and waited, and then he'd heard that the untouchable Lorenzo Ferraro had gone and married a baker. He's gone soft is what they told each other. Distracted. He's got a weakness now, and her name is on the deed of a little shop on College Street. I only learned the shape of it later, in pieces. What I knew at the time was that Lorenzo grew quiet in a new way, that autumn, that Bruno. His right hand, a bear of a man who called me boss's wife and slipped my dog biscuits for the terrier I'd adopted, started sleeping in the car outside the bakery, that the cameras multiplied. I knew that Cody had disappeared, and that this worried my husband more than Cody appearing ever had. The gala was in December, a charity thing at a hotel downtown, black tie, half the city's money in one ballroom, the kind of event where a man like Lorenzo has to be seen being legible and domestic and married, which was the whole point of me. I wore gold. I was 6 weeks pregnant and hadn't told him yet, was waiting for the right moment, carrying the secret around like a warm coal in my chest. I remember thinking, standing at the top of the ballroom stairs on his arm, that I had never in my life been so happy and so afraid at the same time, and that I didn't yet know the two feelings were about to collide. It happened fast, the way real violence does, nothing like the movies. Cody was there. I don't know how he got in. Later I'd understand exactly how, and by whom, but he was there, drunk and wild-eyed, and he came at us screaming across the ballroom, and every head turned, and Lorenzo stepped in front of me, putting his body between me and my ex, reading the threat as the lunatic charging with his hands out, which was the point. Cody was the noise. Cody was the flare sent up to pull every eye to the wrong place. Because over Lorenzo's shoulder, past the string quartet, at the far dark end of the room, where the velvet curtains hung over the balcony doors, I saw a glint. Just a small red bead of light, dancing, and then it steadied, and it settled on the black lapel of my husband's tuxedo, right over his heart. I had grown up in a bakery. I did not know much about the world Lorenzo lived in, but I had watched enough television to know what a red dot on a man's chest means, and I knew that Lorenzo was looking the wrong way, protecting me from the noise and blind to the knife, and there was no time to explain, no time to shout it into words, no time for anything but the thing my body did without asking my permission. I threw myself at him. I am not a small woman. I have never in my life been so grateful for that as I was in that half second. I hit him with the whole weight of me, shoulder into his chest, the same swing I'd learned lifting flour and hauling ovens, and he was off balance, caught mid-turn, and we went down together, hard, onto the marble, me on top of him, and the sound came. Not a bang. A crack, sharp and flat, like a whip splitting the air, and something tore through the space where his heart had been a heartbeat before, and buried itself in the oak of the bar behind us in a spray of splinters. Then the ballroom came apart, screaming, people dropping. Bruno in the dark suits moving all at once with guns I hadn't known, were under all those tuxedos, chairs going over, glass everywhere. And, under me on the cold marble, Lorenzo Ferraro, the most feared man in the city, who had never once looked afraid, looked up at me with something in his face I'd never seen and never wanted to see again, which was terror, pure animal terror, and his hands came up and gripped my arms, and he was checking me, patting me down, saying my name over and over. Are you hit? Are you hit? Tell me you're not hit, because in that half second he'd been convinced the bullet had gone through me to reach him. I'm not hit, I said, and I started to laugh and cry at the same time, shaking on top of him. You're welcome, by the way. He pulled me down against his chest and held me so hard it hurt. Right there on the floor in the middle of the chaos, and into my hair he said something in Italian I didn't understand but felt in my bones. And then in English, cracked and low. Never. Never do that again. Never put yourself between me and... That's literally the whole point of a spine, I said into his lapel. You told me you liked mine. His men had Cody within the minute. And it was Cody, whimpering on the floor with Bruno's knee in his back, who told them the rest, because Cody had never once in his life been able to keep his mouth shut. He'd owed Dragan Kovic's people $40,000. They'd offered to clear it if he'd do one small thing, make a scene at the Ferraro wife's gala. Scream, charge, pull every eye and every gun in the room toward the crazy ex-boyfriend, so that a shooter on the balcony would have his 3 seconds. He'd said yes. He'd sold my husband's life to save his own skin, and he'd used me, the woman he'd called worthless for years, as the bait. I don't know exactly what happened to Dragan Kovac. I made a decision that winter about how much of that world I wanted to carry, and where I wanted to set my grandmother's flour-dusted hands down, and where I didn't, and Lorenzo let me make it, which is its own kind of love. What I know is that by spring the East End crew was a story people told to scare new criminals, that the docks and the concrete went quiet under new management, and that the man who'd married a baker to look weak turned out to be the most dangerous kind of strong, which is the kind that's protecting something it would actually die for. I told him about the baby 3 days after the gala. We were on the balcony of the condo. The whole city spread out below us, frosted white, the lake a sheet of dark glass, and I just took his hand and put it flat on my stomach and watched him understand. Lorenzo Ferraro, who had faced down a sniper's bullet without flinching, went completely to pieces. He sat down on the cold balcony floor. He put his forehead against my belly and he wept, and I stood there in the snow with my hand in his silver-flecked hair, and thought that a year ago I'd been alone in a fancy restaurant needing a napkin, praying nobody would look at me too closely. Our daughter came in September, and she came the hard way, the long way, nothing like the movies. 18 hours. I sweated and I swore and I cried, and at one point I told my husband I was going to break every bone in his hand, and he offered me his other one and said, perfectly serious, break whatever you need to, just bring her to me. He didn't leave the room. He fed me ice chips and let me scream into his shoulder and whispered in Italian against my temple. And when the doctor said push, he was right beside my head, telling me I was the strongest thing he'd ever seen, stronger than he'd ever been. And when she finally came out, furious and red and screaming, this man who ran a criminal empire cried harder than the baby did. We named her for both our grandmothers, a little of his Calabria and a little of my Nana's kitchen. She had a shock of black hair, and when she blinked her eyes open, they were dark. Dark like obsidian, dark like her father's. She has my appetite, and his temper, and a set of lungs that lets the whole building know exactly when she's hungry. And Lorenzo says, with something like pride, that she'll need a loud voice one day, because no daughter of his is going to spend a single hour of her life apologizing for taking up space. I stood on that same balcony a week later with her sleeping in my arms, wrapped in a blanket Colleen had knit, the city going gold under a low autumn sun, and I thought about the woman I'd been in that restaurant, tugging down her dress, certain she was too big, too poor, too much, and not enough at the same time, certain that the empty chair across from her was proof of everything she'd ever believed about herself. That chair hadn't been empty. It had been waiting. My husband came up behind me, careful of my healing body, and rested his chin on my shoulder to look down at our girl, and I said, without turning around, you know, a year and a half ago I was counting loonies to keep the ovens on and dodging a man who told me I was worthless. I thought my whole life was already over. And now? I looked at our reflection in the dark glass of the balcony door, a woman who'd walked through fire and come out gold, a sleeping baby, a man who'd tear down the sky before he'd let either of us get rained on. Sweet Haven was thriving. There was a line out the door most mornings now. People from all over the city, who wanted to buy bread from the baker who married the wolf. Cody was gone, one way or another, a name I never had to say again. Now, I said, turning to kiss him, I think that contract was the best deal I ever signed. He didn't smile the dangerous smile, the one the whole city was afraid of. He smiled the other one, the one only 2 people in the world ever got to see, and one of them was asleep in my arms. It was never a contract, he said, tightening his arm around the both of us. It was always the way it was meant to go. Below us, the streetcars ran their bright lines through the snow, and the city went on about its business, never knowing that up above it, behind the glass, wrapped in flour and love, and one very expensive ring, we had finally, truly, come home.